Act was actually promulgated in 1989. 1990 is when it first came into effect. And after many years working with toxic use reduction planning, the state got a lot of feedback that there were companies who were not able to continue finding opportunities to reduce their chemical use. And so they were asking for some flexibility. In 2006, we went ahead and we created an amendment to the Toxic Use Reduction Act. And that amendment was designed to provide some flexibility for those companies who were feeling like they weren't getting as much value out of the planning process as they used to. And those options are essentially to continue with the TUR planning process or to develop a resource conservation plan, which is what we're going to be talking about today, or to implement a Toxic Use Reduction Act environmental management system. Just so you know, we are planning on putting on a TURI EMS training for anyone who wants to be certified as a TUR EMS planner, so that they can help their company or their clients use the TURI EMS as an alternative to the regular planning process. We're going to be doing that next winter. So just keep your eyes peeled and feel free to reach out at any time if you have questions. So again, you know, the resource conservation planning opportunity was designed to just give some more flexibility to companies. In fact, both of the planning alternatives were designed to provide more flexibility. To integrate toxic use reduction into other sustainability activities and other business activities. And as companies focus more and more on reducing their footprint, being more sustainable, and really being able to communicate that to their customers and their peer companies, that becomes more and more of an interesting opportunity, I think. We know that companies who have implemented resource conservation have identified cost savings and maybe more importantly, opportunities to be more efficient in their production processes. So there's a lot of good reasons to pursue resource conservation planning. And I think a lot of companies do that anyway. But what this does is it gives you an opportunity to take your toxic use reduction planning skills and apply them to a different medium. So other than chemicals, perhaps. So this is how MassDEP has defined what resource conservation is. And you'll see that it is focused on efficiency. It is focused on not shifting risks, right? So just like with toxic use reduction planning, we don't want to do something that shifts the risk from workers to the environment, from the environment to customers, or any other combination of that. And also that doesn't increase the amount of waste generated. And so that it's a very specific kind of a definition, and it relates closely to toxic use reduction planning. There are 5 different, what we call natural assets, that a company can choose to target when they do resource conservation planning. We'll be talking today about materials that contribute to solid waste, but it is important to remember that you can always look at energy conservation, water conservation, or you can apply your TUR planning skills to chemicals that are not otherwise reportable under TURA. In the resource conservation plan, just like with the toxic use reduction plan, there are facility-wide planning aspects, and then there's more process-specific planning aspects. So a resource conservation plan has to identify which natural asset you'd be targeting, right? and then go through a facility-wide review of that asset, identify specific opportunities and prioritize them, and then dive in more deeply to the processes where that asset is being used. When you're doing resource conservation planning, you provide a summary of the options that you've identified and your implementation plan for it, and what your expected change in use would be over the course of the next 2 or 4 years. So in planning, in resource conservation planning, you submit a plan summary to DEP, and then the next year you have to go back and focus on chemicals. You have to go back to do toxic use reduction chemicals, unless the resource conservation planning opportunity that you're looking at is chemicals that are not otherwise reportable. And I take that back. So you do still have to go back to TUR planning. The difference between the other assets, energy, water, and materials, and the chemicals that are not otherwise reportable, is that any planner can do the planning for that natural asset. So that's the difference. And I apologize for saying the wrong thing there. So materials that contribute to solid waste. We have a really good planning guidance available from MassDEP. And so the link is right there. You can go to MassDEP's website, and under the toxic use reduction program side of their website, you can find the guidance resources. And on page 34 is where it provides more specifics about materials contributing to solid waste. Essentially, when you are looking at this asset, when you're looking at materials that contribute to solid waste, you're basically looking at any waste as an opportunity for improvement. So you want to be looking at all of the wastes that may be generated, all the solid wastes in particular that may be generated, and then moving upstream to better identify why those materials, why that solid waste is being generated. And is there something that you can be doing upstream to minimize the generation of that solid waste? And that's very much like toxic use reduction planning, where you're looking at what chemicals am I using? Oops, well, that's okay. You can still see me, I hope. What chemicals am I using? And what byproducts am I generating? And what can I do upstream to make a difference? And that difference really needs to be focused on source reduction. So the facility-wide use characterization is really where you have an opportunity to look beyond just your manufacturing process. Certainly you want to look at your production lines to see if there is something going on there that could be generating solid waste, and could I be making a change in the way I do it to minimize solid waste. But you can go beyond your manufacturing process. You can go beyond your production units to look at things like offices and stock rooms. Do you have a cafeteria or kitchen of some sort? Shipping and receiving areas. Those are areas that may provide good opportunities for reduction of materials, for source reduction. Once you've identified different opportunities, you want to then go ahead and do the technical and financial evaluation of what implementing that opportunity would look like for your own facility. So again, it really follows closely with the toxic use reduction planning process. Here are some examples of opportunities that you can find in the guidance. Reducing material use, looking at office materials, product design, redesigning your packaging or using packaging or implementing packaging return policies, purchasing in bulk. Reusing, donating, or exchanging your materials is another opportunity that companies should be thinking about if they're considering this asset area for planning alternative. Are there things that you can do to reuse packaging that you have arriving on your facility? Can you be reusing office furniture or supplies or donating those things elsewhere? Is there industrial scrap that you're generating that could be used elsewhere? So there are examples of some possibilities, and what we're going to hear today hopefully will give you some more ideas on where there are opportunities for your facility to do some source reduction around materials that are generating solid waste. One of the things that you'll note in the guidance is that it very specifically calls out recycling and composting, both of which are preferable to disposal and are appropriate under this natural asset area if there are no source reduction opportunities. So if you don't have any opportunity to change what you're doing to minimize the amount of material that contributes to solid waste, then recycling and composting are opportunities that you can include in your plan.
Pam,
Yeah.
I have a quick question in the chat that's pretty relevant to what you're talking about. Gary asked, does waste to energy qualify as reduction in this case?
So does waste to energy qualify as reduction under solid waste, Gary, or do you mean under the energy conservation opportunity? And Gary, if you want, you can actually unmute yourself. Thanks for calling that out, Agnes. Appreciate it. Can't hear you, Gary.
Let me see. I'm not sure if you can hear me yet or not.
I can hear you now. Thank you.
Actually, I was looking at both, either as the solid waste side. We recently are from what I can determine, EPA considers us now a zero to landfill. We do a lot of recycling, but less than 5% of our solid waste now goes to a landfill, and the larger portion of that is regulated by the EPA and has no choice but to go to a landfill. The outfit that we go through CMAS, they're doing sorting. They give me reports on how many kilowatt of hours of electricity they're generating with our waste, how many barrels of oil a quarter I'm saving, all of that good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if it is being identified as recycling, and yeah, Kathy Benjamin says that she thinks that's probably more appropriately classified as valorization instead of reduction. It's a really tricky question, and I'm not sure I have a pat answer to that. It's like the question of is switching to a renewable energy source energy conservation? And one of the things with resource conservation planning is that it is a more holistic approach to what you're doing. So yeah, Kathy, you have some thoughts on that. Go for it.
I just wanted to offer up from DEP's perspective, when it comes to waste reduction of materials, waste to energy is considered a form of disposal as opposed to an opportunity for source reduction, as Pam has been describing it. So, you know, in our framework, waste to energy is a disposal option.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll just add again from MassDEP's perspective, disposal being defined as landfill, transfer stations, and municipal waste combustors specifically.
Good, really helpful, really helpful. Thank you so much. Okay, good. Right, reduction at the source is what we're wanting to focus on in the resource conservation planning. So that was very helpful. Here's some other examples that I just pulled out of the slide deck from a presentation that we did last spring. I know that many of you were not at our spring conference. So here were some other suggestions from a peer planner, and really looking at process opportunities, and process opportunities for source reduction can be a little tricky. So redesigning your process, your product to minimize the amount of waste during the processing, operation, managing your scrap by type so that you can get a better handle on where this scrap is and really focus in on reducing certain kinds of scraps. Selecting different ways of doing mechanical treatment of your facility, of your substrates of your product, choosing reusable air emission filter media, reducing packaging and incoming supplies. So these were just some interesting suggestions that our planner last spring offered. But again, I hope that we're going to hear a lot more that'll get you thinking about where there may be opportunities within your own facility. Here's just some examples of some of the solid waste, the materials contributing to solid waste planning that was done in the past decade or so. 2022 being the most recent year that we have the information on. In 2020, there was a company that was focused on office paper, and then of course things really changed. So that was a tough year to implement. But in 2022, we had several companies really diving into resource conservation planning, specifically for materials that contribute to solid waste. One of the things that we know is that we don't have a lot of companies who choose this option. And we certainly would like to have companies think about resource conservation planning, because it allows you to have a more holistic, broader impact on your operation and on the sustainability of your operation. So we certainly want to encourage companies to look for opportunities. These are just some examples of what other companies have done in the past. And we have a lot of companies in Massachusetts who have done resource conservation planning since it was an option in 2006. 2008 was, I think, the first year that was actually an opportunity for companies to dive into. So there's a lot of peers of yours who have been doing really interesting resource conservation, not all of it on the materials side. But there are peers who you can talk to about what they've done to see if it's something that would work for you. So this was just a refresher about what resource conservation planning is about. I will look at the questions in a minute, but what I really want to do is to give our speakers a chance to talk to us some more about their experience with resource conservation planning, and specifically with managing materials that contribute to solid waste. So we're first going to hear from Kathi Mirza, who is the branch chief of municipal waste reduction programs at MassDEP, where she oversees grants, technical assistance, and outreach to increase the effectiveness of municipal waste reduction programs across the Commonwealth. Kathi holds a master's degree in environmental policy and planning from Tufts University, and she's going to provide us an overview of DEP initiatives to reduce waste in Massachusetts. Tom Segear is joining us from Casella. He's the dedicated resource manager for Boston University. And in his current role, Tom actively identifies strategies to improve existing services on campus and finds opportunities to implement innovative programs that bring the university closer to their zero waste goals. prior to joining Casella, Tom had experience working in both the municipal and nonprofit world of waste, developing recycling programs. And then finally, we're going to hear from Sarah Healey, who oversees the Zero Waste Program for BU. Sarah works on the BU Sustainability and Campus Planning and Operations programs. And BU has a goal to be zero waste by 2030. Sarah's role is to implement and refine the strategy outlined in their zero waste plan. For the last 5 years, Sarah has literally stood knee deep in waste. They're a true zero waste advisor and have served on the leadership team of the U.S. Composting Council's Young Professionals. So a really interesting group of speakers are joining us today. I'm really glad to have you all here. I will take a look at some of the questions that are showing up on the chat right now, but I'd like to stop my sharing and hand it over to Kathi.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen okay?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. So let me just scan this. Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me here today. Good afternoon, everybody. As Pam mentioned, my name is Kathi Mirza, and I'm the branch chief for municipal waste reduction programs at MassDEP. And part of what I'll be speaking about today is really going to be a higher level snapshot, including our overall waste reduction goals, as well as some key policies and initiatives we have through our programs. So first, I'd like to take a look with all of you at what we're dealing with right now. So in 2022, which is pretty recent data that we have available, we disposed of 6 million tons of solid waste. That's what our program really works on, is reducing solid waste. And we're managing 6 million tons per year, and that equates to about 4.5 pounds of trash disposed by every person in Massachusetts every single day. Now, a little more than half of this trash is disposed of in Massachusetts, with the majority going to one of the 5 waste combustors across the state, and a relatively small amount, about 14%, goes to landfills in Massachusetts. The balance, which is about 43% of our trash, is actually exported out of state for disposal because many local landfills have closed, and our waste combustors are really running out of capacity. So we see waste being shipped to states like Ohio, New Hampshire, New York, Mississippi, Alabama. It's really moving around. So over the last 5 years, solid waste tonnage from residents and businesses has decreased slightly, but the disposal of non-municipal solid waste, which is primarily from construction and demolition materials, that has increased by about 33%. So altogether, we've seen our disposal tonnage increase by 6% since 2018, which is our baseline year for much of our work. So every 10 years, MassDEP updates our solid waste master plan. So this is our guiding document for managing the waste that's generated in state. And we're currently working off of the plan that covers the 2020 through 2030 period. And we've set some very aggressive waste reduction goals, as you can see on this slide, goals for both 2030 and 2050. And again, that's relative to the baseline of 2018. So we're really aiming to reduce waste disposed by 30% by 2030. Now, during COVID, we had a substantial impact. It had a substantial impact on solid waste for a few years. We saw a spike in trash coming out of cities and towns as many folks started to work from home, and children were schooling from home as well. So a lot more was coming out of the residential sector. We're now seeing tonnages come down relative to the back closer to the pre-COVID levels for many communities, which is good to see. But despite that, we still have a long way to go to reach our 30% waste reduction goal. And you can see that we're aiming for 90% waste reduction by 2050, very lofty. And managing solid waste is a substantial and ongoing cost, as you all know very well. And from a business operations perspective, waste is often an indicator of inefficiency somewhere in the process. So reducing this waste will not only save you all money, but it has a substantial impact on the climate as a result of greenhouse gas emissions that are generated from the disposal of this waste. If in Massachusetts that we're able to meet our 2030 waste reduction goal, we could actually prevent 1.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, or the equivalent of conserving about 200 million gallons of gasoline, if we're able to meet that goal. Now, the state's climate policies really focus explicitly on the disposal impacts, and they're targeting certain reduction areas of carbon dioxide from waste combustors in particular, by reducing plastics disposal. And so there are initiatives underway to reduce and phase out single-use plastic products and packaging. And while it's not explicit in our solid waste master plan, we are learning more and more about the upstream impacts when we look at the life cycle of the stuff that we buy and use every day. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which looks at a lot of these issues on a global scale, they estimate that about 45% of global greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to the production of materials, products, and food. And that's because of the energy that's used to mine raw materials, to process them, to manufacture, to transport, and to bring them out to the stores and where folks are buying them. And so much of this is single use, unfortunately. So this slide shows us some of the top materials that we are targeting for additional diversion potential in Massachusetts, keeping in mind that these materials are not waste in and of themselves until we actually waste them. So if you look at this pie chart, what it actually reflects is what we're seeing from the waste characterization studies that are done every 3 years at the 5 waste combustors that we have in Massachusetts. So every 3 years, these very comprehensive studies are done to look very closely at what we're still throwing away as trash. And so then with this information, we focus our efforts on trying to grow the infrastructure and capacity to enable reuse and recycling and composting while helping residents and businesses capture these materials through a variety of programs. You can see so much of this is organic material, paper, plastic, and so many other types of materials that have value. We want to capture those. And you may know that
we have a question. I'm sorry, we had a question about what is organic material?
In this space, this organic material would be, the majority of it would be food material. So it would be food scraps, but it would also comprise some, it can be like soiled cardboard that might be wet and that wouldn't be able to be recycled. So that would be considered an organic material, and also a very limited amount of, say, leaves and yard waste. You don't see a lot of leaves and yard waste in the waste stream. Most of that is captured separately, but we have a tremendous amount of opportunity to capture more food scraps. So that would be the majority of that. You may be familiar with the waste bans in Massachusetts. These are regulations that prohibit the disposal of certain types of recyclables and some hazardous items that are prohibited from disposal with the trash. So those would be common items like cardboard, paper, bottles, and cans, but it also includes things like mercury-bearing items, clean gypsum wallboard, clean wood, asphalt, brick, and concrete, and other materials like that. So we really aim to capture these materials for higher value uses, for reuse, composting, recycling, and proper disposal. We really want to work together to capture the value here. So you'll want to, as companies, be sure to take a close look at what your organization is throwing away, and work with your vendors to really try to capture the value of materials that you're generating a lot of, because the value may be being lost there. One of the examples that Pam mentioned in the introduction very briefly, which I also had here, is the idea of considering opportunities for reuse. And one of those areas would be with furniture from office spaces. there are outlets that will take that and that can redirect it, that are materials that are still in good, usable condition that can be redirected to others where it can still be used. And so we want to keep that material, those types of items out of the trash. And so really get to know what you're throwing away. I just wanted to now take a few minutes to tell you a little bit more about our reuse efforts. And so MassDEP established a Reduce and Reuse Working Group as part of our 2030 Solid Waste Master Plan. And at the end of 2021, we released our state's very first Reduce and Reuse Action Plan. And the idea of this is that we really want to direct more of our attention to the reduction of upstream waste that is coupled with greenhouse gas emissions associated with that waste. And through a number of stakeholder meetings, we've identified priority materials to focus on for reuse. So this Reduce and Reuse Action Plan that we have really provides a vision and some strategies that will support waste reduction and reuse before recycling. We work together with lots of stakeholders in different sectors to identify some of the barriers that they experience, as well as opportunities to address these streams, which by some measures can represent the most substantial impacts to the environment when it comes to solid waste. Because it's estimated that for every ton of material that we manage as a waste, there are as many as 70 tons of upstream waste that's generated beforehand that we don't even see. So our action plan outlines some strategies that we have in our toolbox that include things like education, technical support and training, procurement resources, and lots more, grants, financial incentives. Some of the strategies identified can be implemented by DEP, but others require partnership and collaboration with a variety of different sectors and agencies. So through this Reduce and Reuse work group, the material streams noted on this slide were identified as priorities for reuse, where we saw the greatest amount of opportunity. A lot of materials generated in these spaces, and we also thought there was opportunity to try to capture it. So these, the primary categories that we're going after here, at least to begin with, would be single-use packaging, building materials, electronics, textiles and clothing, household durable goods, and then the furniture, fixtures, and equipment that come from businesses and institutions. So I'd like to give you a snapshot of the work that we've done so far, starting with building material. So a few years ago, we established a deconstruction work group, and the idea of that was to connect stakeholders in this arena, which is pretty vast, in order to really try to capture the value of buildings and their constituent materials for reuse rather than waste. So why? Why are we focusing on reuse and deconstruction? Well, what we've come to learn through the work in this, this working group is that between 30 to 40% of what we dispose of in Massachusetts is construction and demolition material. It's a huge portion of what we're managing, and about 90% of that is from demolition, from buildings being knocked down, renovations. We also know that we have a disposal capacity shortfall, both in state and in the Northeast, and we don't see new disposal outlets coming online. So we really, really want to tighten our belts. So specifically for C&D, or construction and demolition, we aim to reduce this stream by over 250,000 tons by 2030, which is more than double the current recycling rate right now. And when I refer to construction, I'm talking about the process of disassembling or dismantling a structure and its components to really try to maximize the recovery of any valuable and reusable materials that are a part of that. So think of it as construction in reverse. And in many cases, it really is a viable alternative to traditional demolition. This photo comes from a job site in the Seaport District from just about a year and a half ago, showing what it looks like to set up a site for dismantling and separation of building materials into different categories so that they can be marketed for reuse and recycling. So one of those containers has scrap metal. There is a pile of lumber that's to the side there, and there's gypsum, and there are bricks, and things are just sorted out so that they can actually go to other destinations for use. So a snapshot of our goals as a deconstruction work group are on this slide, but a couple of key things are that we really just want to identify opportunities for reuse, even before recycling. We want to help to grow the reuse industry for building materials in Massachusetts. What are the needs and how can we help that come to be? And we also, of course, want to minimize the climate impacts through better management of these valuable resources that are already in circulation. In our deconstruction work group, we've had 7 meetings so far, focusing on a variety of topics. This just gives you a snapshot with the dates and the titles for these meetings that we've had. We've invited in local and national experts to speak to these different issues. And it's been super interesting, a lot of resource sharing and people from different sectors coming together. So a lot of cross collaboration is really starting to bubble up here. From learning about what deconstruction is, seeing how it's really being done in some parts of the country right now. Where are the outlets and markets for these materials? How does this intersect with historic preservation and retaining the culture in our communities? What is already happening in Massachusetts? What kind of workforce development might be needed and that would benefit the growth in this space? And one of the key takeaways, there have been many takeaways, but one of them, the things that we've learned and heard again and again, is that the greenest building is the one that is already built. And how adaptive reuse of an existing structure, as well as recycling and reusing any materials that are captured through deconstruction, can reduce project costs, they can support local job creation, and it helps maintain architectural style of an area and reintegrating locally sourced materials. My team is currently in the process of planning a winter workshop or charrette with representatives from all stakeholder groups to inform guidance that we'll be creating to help develop this ecosystem. So another waste stream we're working to address is single-use packaging. Our first foray into the space aims to address single-use takeout containers, which are a substantial source of waste in the food service sector. Now, single-use foodware emerged as a priority material because there's just so much of it, and it's often challenging or confusing to recycle or compost. And so we want to together try to move away from single-use disposables in foodware and make the transition to reusables and learn what is needed to enable that. So MassDEP has been collaborating with our state's Department of Public Health, as well as many local and regional health officials to develop some best management practices here. So again, our goal is always reducing waste that's going for disposal while ensuring that any recommendations that we come up with are consistent with the state's food code and protection of public health. So we've had, in collaboration with Recycling Works Massachusetts, that does a lot of our commercial technical support programming, had stakeholder listening sessions, a number of them, bringing in restaurants and health officials and companies that make reusable foodware and companies that provide warewashing and anyone who's really interested in this type of work and reducing single-use foodware disposables. We wanted to really just increase our understanding of the issues and build consensus toward reusable foodware and containers and what that could look like. So we looked really closely at reusable containers that are provided by the food service establishment itself and what they can do. We also spoke a bit at length about beverage containers that can be provided by the customers that come into an establishment with their own containers and what would be the protocols that would allow that to happen and use safely for everyone involved. And we also looked at customer-provided containers that would be used in bulk retail settings. So those were the key things we wanted to focus on because so much waste is coming out of those spaces. The best practices guidance is in its final stages right now of review with the Department of Public Health and will be released and publicized very soon for sharing out. And this is the last stream I'm going to touch on this afternoon. The next stream is going to be about textiles and clothing. So this stream represents more than 5% of all the waste that's disposed of in Massachusetts. It's a surprisingly large amount of waste. And maybe it isn't so surprising with fast fashion, frankly, because it's just, we're really quite overwhelmed with this material. There were more than 230,000 tons of textile materials thrown away as trash in 2022. So our goal is to reduce the amount wasted by at least half of that by 2030. And in 2022, DEP implemented or added some new materials to our list of waste bans. Again, those items that are prohibited from disposal as trash. So textiles are now a waste ban material. And we're working with municipalities and the textile industry to try to capture more of this material for reuse and recycling. Now, most of the stream has value. We have been told by industry, the textile industry, for a number of years now that they can use up to 95% of the textiles that are recovered through these types of programs, whether it's through reuse or making wiping cloths or being shredded to be used as shoddy and other types of items. So the vast majority of what's captured can be used. And typically there is little to no cost for collection of these materials. And so municipalities or businesses or whomever, any entities that want to start collecting them, there's typically no cost to do it because the material itself has that much value. And in fact, sometimes rebates are available if a certain amount of tonnage is collected. And MassDEP does really support textile recovery through our grants as well as through our market development programs. And we also hold a yearly summit with the textile recovery organizations to get updates on how things are going for them, where the issues are, and how we can help and intervene so that this can work well for all involved. And one thing, we've heard a number of things, I should say, pretty resoundingly, and that is that reuse is really a priority for them over recycling as well. There's much more value in it when they can resell something as it is, rather than processing it further. We've learned that more is reusable and recyclable than most of us really think. They can take the vast majority of items, as long as it's not like oily or moldy. It has to be pretty bad for them to not take it. And the industry is aware of the environmental impacts of managing textiles. And so diversion and reuse are top of mind for them. It's also good business. Now, this is the last slide that I have with a lot of information on it, but it really is intended to give a snapshot of MassDEP's key initiatives in, outside of our reduce and reuse work group. These are just some of our initiatives across our municipal branch and our commercial branch that are designed to provide resources and tools and guidance in a variety of ways. We offer grants, as I mentioned, to municipalities, to nonprofits, to businesses and institutions that are at varying stages of addressing the waste they generate. We have several different technical assistance programs. Some are specific to municipalities, but we also have our Recycling Works program that is administered through CET in Western Mass, and they provide technical support to businesses and institutions on all things waste reduction. They also have a really great online directory for looking up different resources and service providers for collecting and managing recyclables and organics and the like. We provide outreach and education. A few of the graphics I have shown here on the slide, the top one is one that represents sort of what is recyclable or what isn't, so that we can have consistent information available to everyone across Massachusetts. We worked with all of our recycling facilities to make sure that we could come up with an accurate list of what was acceptable and marketable as a recyclable that comes out of Massachusetts. And we also have a directory, as I mentioned, of resources through Recycling Works in the bottom right. It's a great resource, their website. I just put a little plug in here for their furniture and office equipment reuse guidance, but there's all sorts of really fabulous guidance for businesses on that website. MassDEP also does waste inspections and enforcements to ensure compliance. And we really just work to continuously evaluate our programs and revise what we do so we can maximize waste reduction opportunities. So my parting thought for all of you would be, as best as possible, get to know your own waste stream and work with your current contractor, your vendor who provides trash and recycling services. Perhaps they could do a waste audit for you. You can really look closely at what your organization is generating. Look for opportunities to capture those materials that have value and redirect them for reuse and recycling to the greatest extent. And here's my contact information if you would like to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathy. We had a lot of activity on the chat while you were talking. Ted, I think, wrapped it up really nicely, saying this was a great presentation overview. So much appreciated. We had a question about the waste bans and specifically cardboard is a banned material. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. What are can you just quickly remind us what the current banned materials are in Massachusetts?
You know, I could probably, it would be easiest to put a link in the chat for all of you, but it's going to be the common recyclables like paper, cardboard, bottles and cans. It would be appliances. It would be cathode ray tubes like electronics, if you can envision those deep TVs that we had in the past. Asphalt, brick, concrete, gypsum wall board, organics of a certain quantity, textiles, mattresses, a whole lot. So
nicely done.
It's kind of head spinning. I did my best, but yeah, well, if someone hasn't put a link in the chat, we'll do that in just a moment.
Great, thanks. And another question about the solid waste master planning process, and are those meeting minutes available to the public?
Absolutely. I'll also put a link in there for our work group. And then also we have a variety of, we have the Solid Waste Advisory Committee, and then there are other committees that are subsets of that may be of interest. So I'll go into the chat and add things while the next speaker is on.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think the bottom line is that Massachusetts is clearly very active in making our waste management program work well. Kelly points out that there was an article recently that said that Massachusetts was really the only state whose food waste reduction program had been successful. So kudos to you all and the hard work that you've been doing. And it's really important for us to be thinking about where are there opportunities with our own facilities where we might be able to take advantage of some of the resources. Recycling Works, as you mentioned, is really a great resource for our planners. And for those of you looking for some credit for attending workshops, all you need to do is to approach DEP ahead of time and get pre-approval to get credit for attending things like the workshops that Recycling Works puts on. So what I'd like to do is move on and invite Tom to join us now and talk a little bit more about some specific activities that you can do with your waste service providers. So Tom.
Thanks, Pam.
Thank you.
All right, can you see the slide all right?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Awesome. As Pam had already mentioned, I'm Tom Segear with Casella Waste. I'm the dedicated resource manager for the Boston University account. So I also have my BU colleague on here, Sarah Healey, who I'll be passing the presentation over to a little bit later on, just to talk about some of the finer details of the work going on campus. So one of the things I'm going to start with is how at Casella and other companies as well, we're starting to get away from the idea of waste management and really think about it as resource management. Traditional view when it comes to waste management is focusing on disposal and moving materials off your location, out of your home, out of your office space. And it led to a lot of inefficiencies. So when we kind of take the ideas and practices around resource management and apply them to dealing with our waste, we're able to take a more holistic approach when addressing waste, looking at why material is being generated, where it's being generated, does it need to be generated, and then also finding those highest and best uses for the materials that we're dealing with at the end of the day, looking for areas of reduction, reuse, and recycling outlets for different materials post being manufactured as well as after. Um, this is a little breakdown, just kind of looking at the present and then the future of this idea of resource management while we're dealing with waste. One of the things I really like here is there are no waste streams, only wasted resources. So being able to identify those materials, working around circularity, carbon reduction, if you have zero waste or waste reduction goals, outlining those and finding your solutions to get there. So there's a lot of different components when we're talking about resource management. This isn't a new idea, it's just a new way to apply it to the work that we're doing. You'll see a breakdown of the different topics that resource management touches upon and how we kind of incorporate it when we're dealing with resources and waste on a day-to-day basis with organizations that use us for a service provider. We think about third-party alliances, partnership with our internal programs and systems, and also partners to be able to move different types of materials for reuse and recycling. We talk about environmental improvements, setting goals for waste reduction and zero waste and carbon neutrality, and using data and accurate data and technology to be able to track those metrics and apply them to the goals as we're goal setting in the process. One of the big parts of resource management is service optimization. Having one or two contacts as opposed to having multiple contracts, dealing with different scopes of work and different materials, kind of making those efficiencies, bringing it all together and being able to move forward more efficiently. This is an old case study from the EPA and how resource management impacted the automotive assembly plant. You'll see on the left that before resource management was really applied to the industry, there was a plant that had 9 different contracts, some for disposal, some for hauling of material, different consulting studies, being able to get a waste characterization done, and other specialty streams that were being generated. As they moved towards the resource management idea and system, they saw cost savings of up to 30%, as well as that increase in resource efficiency. The efficiencies come when you have that one dedicated resource at the plant or with the organization to be able to organize and better understand what materials are being generated, how they're being moved around a plant or a facility or a campus, and being able to redirect materials internally. Some of that work is also done with the waste data that we're able to collect, tracking metrics that go towards diversion as well as reduction, and being able to really understand material movement at a location. This slide is adapted from the Recycling Works Massachusetts resource that was mentioned earlier. And these are some of the best practices that are laid out for resource management. That first note that you'll see there is establishing a baseline for cost, performance, and service levels to really get a true understanding of what costs are associated with current resource management and waste services being provided, what kind of performance is happening, whether it be schedules, types of services, types of materials being moved, different contracts associated with the different materials, and then the actual service levels. How frequently are things being collected? How is that impacting greenhouse gas emissions? And what kind of areas of improvement can you find within that baseline? Establishing that initial baseline also gives you an opportunity to set realistic goals and expectations around zero waste planning and waste reduction planning. You always have that data point to go back to and really track your progress and know if you're hitting the goals associated with it. The other line item is aligning all services to support resource efficiency. So being able to consolidate some of the services that are happening, making sure there's no redundancies in the system. Again, I keep saying it, but just finding efficiencies within the system to increase those efficiencies. Rethinking your service provider scope and relationship in the bidding process. So really kind of sitting down and understanding what you're looking for in the service provider. Is it just your average service, the traditional waste services that you're thinking about, or do you want a more comprehensive system? Do you want the opportunity to be able to conduct waste audits, a waste characterization study, implement forms of right sizing, which is when you're looking at those service levels and looking for adjustments and finding the efficiencies in the services. And then within that RFP and bid process, setting the goals and making those goals obtainable together and have that partnership. Establish transparent pricing for services. Sarah's going to touch on this in a little bit more detail, but thinking about the scope of work that's going to be needed to get to your waste reduction or zero waste goals, and having outlined pricing associated with different services, kind of like a la carte menu, to be able to budget out and plan accordingly to your goals. And then lastly, providing direct financial incentives for resource efficiency and innovation. So thinking about what compensation comes with some of the right sizing and efficiencies that are found within the services that are going to be provided. Look for cost savings as far as reduction in number of hauls, right sizing the size of containers, as well as frequency of collection. And also what materials will you be able to remove from disposal and put towards reduction and reuse categories. This is an overview of Casella. So we have physical assets throughout the Northeast as well as the Mid-Atlantic, but we also provide different types of services across the country. In the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, we really rely and lean on our physical assets. We have hauling divisions where we're actually moving the material ourselves. We have end sites for recycling facilities for sorting, organics facilities, waste to energy plants. I know that was a topic that came up earlier. But then throughout the country, as well as the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, we're providing those consulting services and those resource management services, predominantly in the manufacturing side, but starting to look at how we can implement it at college campuses and universities and other organizations and institutions. Within those services, these are kind of the 6 categories that kind of were within our scope of work. And you'll see how they kind of lean on each other throughout the work we do. So for like our solutions group, who's doing a lot of this resource management work, leaning on those physical assets of recycling facilities within our footprint, as well as organic end sites, and then waste to energy end sites, being able to utilize the different areas of business to be able to find and achieve those resource management goals. And lastly, before I pass it over to Sarah, these are kind of the building blocks to drive towards resource management. So you start out with reliable waste and recycling services, just your standard baseline services, and then how we build to build the relationships and work towards the waste reduction and zero waste goals that we've set to achieve. We implement education and outreach, specifically on campus. I can speak on doing waste audits out in the public so that students and campus staff and faculty can see the waste being generated, breaking down the different materials that are still left in the disposal side of the wastes, and talking about different ways to incorporate pilot programs to address some of those wastes like textiles, food waste, and redirect them to reduction or reuse outlets. One of the major components of the resource management relationships is having accurate data to be able to drive your progress and track things against that baseline. Sarah's going to talk a little bit more in depth about the data that Boston University has gathered around their waste and how it's helped make their decisions regarding their zero waste goals that they set out for themselves. Advancing sustainability and special waste we look for those specialty items like lab plastics that aren't currently accepted in your traditional single stream recycling, but there's special outlets for that. So designing pilot projects to understand the volume of specialty materials and look for end sites and outlets that'll accept them and be able to find their highest and best use for that material. Sarah, I'm going to pass it over to you to kind of go through the case study of Boston University.
Thank you, Tom. So hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Healey. I'm the Zero Waste Manager for Boston University. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we're doing here on campus, along with what Tom is doing to help us out. My background, I came from Casella before I started at BU. So it's the Strategic Account Manager for Higher Ed and Healthcare in the greater Boston area. So for me, I've kind of worked on this on both the hauler side, but also on the university customer side. So I think I kind of have a unique experience of how this has kind of looked on the ground in implementing these types of things. Tom, will you go to the next slide? So for us here at BU, our big focus was on, back up a little bit, we have a goal to be zero waste by 2030. Oh, sorry, Tom, you can stay there. But with that, we knew that we were going to need a contract in place that was designed to get us to that goal. In a traditional waste contract, typically haulers are paid based on tonnage. So the more you generate, the more potential money the contractors are able to make from that contract. And what we really wanted to do through our process was to align the incentives between our waste hauler resource management provider and our goals as a campus. So we really kind of started our process by really trying to understand what we wanted as a campus. So we assembled a focus group. This included members from facilities, sustainability, sourcing, and zero waste consultants that we worked with. We did lots of research on best practices. We used the MassDEP and Recycling Works resources that were shared earlier, along with the resource management resources from the EPA. And with that, we were really trying to design an RFP that would get us what we wanted and help us get to that zero waste goal. We weren't really sure what existed in the market, so we started with a request for qualifications. And what we did here is we really threw everything we could at the wall to see what the industry was able to do. What was available now? What did they think would be available in the future? And this is really what set us up to be able to draft our RFP that was very specific in what we wanted from our waste hauler. And how we were going to design that as, instead of a hauling contract, a resource management contract. So once that went out, I think from my perspective, we had an RFP that was very clear, very well researched, and outlined the pieces that we were going to take into consideration when we were evaluating those RFPs. One of the big things is that we were not fully deciding on price. We were deciding on what would the long-term impacts of this contract be on zero waste for the campus. So as we went into the evaluation process, we asked clarifying questions. We focused on what it would actually be like to have a resource manager, Tom, working on our campus. And then we reviewed our references and got our zero waste plan fully adopted on campus so that we could award the contract. Tom, will you head to the next slide? So for our resource management contract, we kind of had three big pieces that we were looking at. The first was our pricing structure. These are a few of the resource management options, kind of similar to what Tom was talking about. We really looked at that a la carte menu style where we could opt in to additional services. So we had additional services for things like a waste characterization study, additional waste audits, support for events and things like that. We also have things like a CPI increase to avoid risk for the vendor, an innovation clause to incentivize Casella to bring innovative ideas to our campus. And then we set costs for value-added services that kind of go above and beyond what would have been seen in more of a traditional contract. The next piece is data and technology, and this was a really big one for us because we wanted to be able to measure and track our progress over time to know if we were actually getting closer to that goal. So what we did in our contract is we kind of took all of our material streams and we tried to consolidate as much as possible under what we referred to as our prime hauler. This became Casella, and what this did is it made a large chunk of our data all captured in one place. This is a screenshot of our dashboard that Casella provides us. So we were getting an online dashboard with relatively real-time data. And this gives us the ability to look at each individual location, know where we are running into problems, and attack those problems with zero waste solutions as quickly as we can. Tom, will you go to the next one? And then the final piece was our value-added services. The biggest of this was our dedicated resource manager. For the dedicated resource manager, one of the big things we did with this was to try to pull a lot of the day-to-day operations management away from the zero waste manager position. And what this has done is it's really given me the time to focus more inside of our buildings with our BU community to try to get some of these zero waste programs in place. So while Tom has kind of been doing a lot of the right sizing, the data tracking, and a lot of the kind of service management, I've been able to refocus my time to grow and expand our move out donation program. We increased it by more than 40 tons of diversion, and really kind of grow some of these other programs that we have on campus. We also, within our value-added services, had a program timeline, right sizing, waste audits, all sorts of things. And Tom has helped with a wide variety of projects on our campus. It's really built in a lot of redundancy in our system so that we're able to more effectively cover for each other and make sure that things don't fall through the cracks.
So this is a slide I'd put together just to talk about how specifically time is spent like at a campus or an organization as a resource manager dedicated to the account. As Sarah had mentioned, kind of taking on some of that program and service oversight, taking the workload off of a campus or organization is a big factor. And then there's more time for that institution or organization to kind of strategically plan towards their zero waste goals or waste reduction goals. And then managing elements of the data that we had talked about in the dashboard, as well as administrative support, and that third-party vendor management, managing other folks operating on campus that are generating waste, and making sure that we're capturing that data and understanding the costs associated with those services to make sure that it's all consolidated.
And I think one of the most important things about this is what the results have actually been. We're about 3.5 years into this resource management contract with Casella, and we are seeing real results from it. So our contract started in July of 2021, which for us is the beginning of fiscal year 22. And what you can see here is that getting that real data showed us that we actually had a much better diversion rate than we had thought we did. We were generating a lot less trash because we were overestimating on averages. And it has allowed us to track our progress over time. I think that you can see in the last 3 years, we've seen the waste reducing, and we've seen our various programs kind of change over time. This is available publicly on our website if you would like to track it. But prior to our resource management contract, we were between like a 30 or 35% diversion rate, and now we are up to about 52% with a 45% reduction in waste from our baseline year of 2006. So I think what we've really seen is that this resource management contract is supporting BU in getting to our goal of zero waste, although as you can see from this, we've still got a long way to go. I think that we're really beginning to see the needle move and kind of begin to push us to where we want to be. Tom, will you go back for a second? There's just a question on that. The diversion bar is the white line that you see in there. That's tracking on there. If you go on our website and look at this, you'll actually be able to like kind of hover over it and it will tell you what the diversion rates are. Next one. Additionally, from some of our outcomes, we are on track with our current operations plan as well as our program timeline. Through our right sizing efforts, we've seen a 14% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We've completed 4 waste audits annually. Although we have not done a waste characterization study yet, we're still getting a lot of other data. And then from an education and outreach standpoint, we've expanded our compost programs, supported zero waste building certification for our newest building, and attended lots of educational events across our campus. And then finally, through the resource management contract, we've been able to kick off a lab plastic specialty recycling program, as well as continue to adapt and improve our move out program for diverting waste, specifically around mattress toppers, which for those of you who don't know, are very common on college campuses, where they're like a foam topper that you put on top of your mattress. So overall, I think that we've seen some really positive outcomes from this, and we hope that it will continue in the direction that's headed so we can get to zero waste by 2030.
Great, thanks,
This
Sarah.
is terrific. Thank you so much. Sorry, it took me a minute to unpin. Tom, if you could stop sharing, I want to just see if we can't, answer some questions, but I'd like to start by just pointing out that what you've been describing at BU is a very complex waste, picture. And I suspect that a lot of what you've done is something that manufacturing facilities could also be doing. So I want to encourage people to think beyond, well, we're not a university, to really look at like, what are some of the things that I could be implementing in my own facility? And one of those things is really working with your contractor or contractors to incentivize waste reduction. Sarah, you had a thought?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that this is actually difficult to do at a university because we have so little input, so little control over our inputs to campus. Whereas in a manufacturing setting, you have a lot more control over what you're purchasing. It's usually happened through like a centralized process, things like that. So you could potentially make some of these changes much easier by kind of highlighting what is in your waste, as was talked about earlier as well.
Great, thank you. So the incentivizing your contractor to help with waste reduction, I think, is a very new idea for me. So I'm curious if anybody in the room has any questions about that or has experienced that in their own facilities that would like to share. Rather than focusing on whether or not you'll get the slides, which I see there's a lot of activity there. I'd like to see if anybody has any experiences or any questions for any of our presenters today about waste management and about source reduction with respect to your use of materials. So let me see. We have a whole lot of BU people apparently who are quite happy about that. Okay, well then let me just ask a question or two. So Kathi, you're the municipal waste chief and branch chief. Is there anything unique to industrial waste management that perhaps you just want to kind of point out?
I just saw that my colleague, Claudine, just put her camera on. Claudine is the commercial waste reduction branch chief, who works alongside me. So I work with municipalities. Claudine works with businesses and institutions. So Claudine, would you like to take a stab at that?
I saw a number of questions. Oh,
You're echoing, just so you know.
oh, really? Is it better now?
It's a little bit better. I'm gonna just make sure everybody else is muted. Go ahead, Claudine.
Yeah, I saw a number of questions just, in regards to the, regulatory kind of perspective. Recycling does not equate to the recovery of energy from the combustion of a material or to create a fuel. It's also not defined as composting or conversion. But that being said, we're working actually on a grant right now in the innovation landscape, and tentatively will be posted March of 2025. So we're certainly open to hearing about more innovative approaches to commercial waste reduction.
Thanks, Claudine. I'm sorry. The audio is the reverb. I'm not quite sure where that's coming from, but I appreciate you being here. And so Claudine and Kathi are both resources for folks to reach out to. Let's see. We have one person who pointed out that they've started reusing liners, which saved them tons of waste a year at a Rockland tape plant. And we also had a conversation recently with a facility that was using plastic liners to minimize the amount of tank cleaning that was required. So that is an example where you may be actually generating more solid waste in order to reduce chemical use. But so
and one other thought on that, Pam, sorry to interrupt, is when I think of like corporate cafeterias that some of these folks on the call might have, those are places where there may be opportunities to reduce any single-use items that we were mentioning earlier. That just popped to mind. And someone else mentioned, I like creative thoughts that folks are putting in the chat, because I think it's knowing your own stream, and that's what it comes down to, is like looking at what is generated within that institutional setting. But one person I think mentioned about the cost of recycling versus trash. I don't know if you want to take that on, Tom. I guess I think it depends on what's being recycled. I'll say that if it's what I've seen is that, like, materials like cardboard have value. It's dry if it's kept separated. There'll always be a cost to transport materials, whatever it is, typically. But some materials will have commodity value. And cardboard is one of those that has commodity value. Aluminum has a lot of value. Good, white office paper, a lot of value. I would say like shredding, if there's any paper shredding that maybe happens in these corporations. I don't know if there's an opportunity I don't know if Casella does that sort of thing, but some companies do shredding events where you're able to capture that for recycling as well.
Yeah, and Kathi, to add on there too, just the cost of transportation, and then the cost of actually sorting the material to make sure that it's clean and segregated enough to be able to be sold to the end user for recycling or reuse and or downcycling in some instances.
So Paul points out he's finding that recycling our typical waste materials in our shipping receiving area is significantly more expensive than disposing of these items in the trash stream, they're willing to pay the cost, but not all companies would be willing to do so. Do you have some suggestions for how to flip that scenario so that they're able to capture the benefit, the cost benefit of recycling? Sarah?
So one of the things that we've done on campus is that we try to save money in one place and then use that money to fund zero waste programs in another. So right now we're working on a project to replace paper towel dispensers with hand dryers. And although this program comes at a cost, we expect there to be custodial labor savings from not having to empty the trash as frequently. So we're kind of utilizing those different savings to fund the program somewhere else. We've done this with compost labor where we've stopped servicing office waste bins and made people put everything into a centralized bin. And then we've used that funding that kind of existed to implement compost in that same space. So now, and we're kind of just shifting the resources from one place to another rather than trying to ask for more resources, which is often a difficult thing to get.
Right, interesting. Tom, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and to add on to that is just going through those right sizing initiatives, know the waste that you're generating, know if it brings more value, if you're able to source separate and move it in that regards. And then, looking at service frequency, container types, and things like that can all kind of help fluctuate the costs in different ways.
Great. Kathi points out that they've been able to reduce chipboard by changing their palletizing methods. Really good example of something in the kind of the industrial side of things a company can be looking at. Kathi, do you want to say more on that?
It really was just a matter of palletizing differently. We did automate the system, and where we used to use 7 pieces of chipboard per pallet, where we are using 1 now. And it turns out to be a great savings because I was rather surprised to find out that a piece of chipboard cost $1. So quite a bit of savings there.
Interesting. Cool. And Sandra asks who the end users for various recycled materials are, and are they domestic or offshore?
Yeah. So it's a mix for all of those questions. The recycling products are commodities. There's an end market where folks are buying, selling, and trading these commodities. A lot of is happening domestically. Some is happening overseas. Plastics right now for us are staying domestic. One of the purchasers of plastic is textile companies in that recycled like fleece material that you're seeing out on the market being used in that way is a good example.
And then one last question, I think here. The dining hall at BU seemed to be a big source, right? What was done to address source reduction?
We have done a lot. We have kind of got a variety of different programs, but the first one that we did was doing training with the back of house kitchen staff and redesigning our dining halls. So within our dining halls, the 3 large ones are all eat in only. So basically anyone who eats there, everything goes back on a dish return. So all of the sorting gets done back of house, which helps us more effectively sort the waste rather than relying on the human behavior side on the front of house part of the restaurant. We've also done training on how to more effectively process fruits and vegetables to have less waste. We have designed menus that utilize waste from some of the food waste to kind of recreate a new meal. We've kind of got a variety of different things. They did like a fun dinner where it was all food scraps that they made a whole dinner out of on campus. And then on the single-use items, we rolled out our Choose to Reuse program. There's a handful of case studies out there on the internet about it. I'll try to share one before the session ends. but we're doing that for coffee cups at one of our cafes, and we're hoping to expand that. And we've seen a significant amount of waste, like a couple of tons reduced from elimination of our single-use disposable takeout containers from a lot of our takeaway dining facilities. And there's probably more, but I'll share some links for you all.
Thank you. Thank you. And Kathi just shared something as well. So let's see. So any thoughts on trading out water bottle sales to quench-like systems or hydrator systems? And is there a kind of an add-on savings by being able to reduce the number of refrigeration units required to keep bottled water cold for your workers in this case? Thoughts on that, anyone?
That's an excellent idea. I can tell you at the DEP offices, Claudine's nodding too. I often get asked because we use municipal water, but it goes through a filtration system, and then people can use their reusable water bottles, and they're getting filtered water, and it can be either cold or hot. And then it eliminates single-use bottles altogether. Just the same.
Imagine that at Cumberland Farms.
Imagine, right? Yeah.
I think that behavior change is a big part of, in particular, the materials source reduction dilemma. You know, you really need to get your workforce, your users on board as best as possible. Any final thoughts on how to really work with workers to get them on board so that you're successful?
One of the things that we've done is kind of an like you're required to opt out rather than opt in to a program. So for our Choose to Reuse program, that is the choice. And then you can opt to spend money to get a disposable. So instead of relying on the human behavior change or kind of the goodwill of people to always do the right thing, we're kind of putting the option that we want as the easy option. And then we charge people if they are uncompliant. So it kind of provides like an opt-out metric instead of an opt-in sort of process.
That's great. Yeah, so lots of things that companies can be doing. Let's see. Beth mentions they have a client who has a lot of drivers putting out more recycling bins where the drivers stop between runs, increased recycling. Before they didn't have time to walk to the nearest recycling bin. Simple little solutions. So again, I think in each individual facility, really understanding why waste is being generated and looking for opportunities to make source reduction an easier choice is really the goal. So I want to thank all of our speakers. Claudine, thank you for joining us as well. And thank you all for coming. I will absolutely be reaching out to our planners to make sure that I am getting slides to each person that was looking for it. And yes, we will be doing surveys after the end of this conference. So I want to thank our speakers. I wish you all a good evening. Thank you all for joining us. Have a nice day.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure. I want to let people go if they want to.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, I still don't understand what you mean about diversion. I just clicked on the link for diversion and read down through there, and I don't see where it separately talks about diversion. So can you just maybe say it differently to me one time? I just don't understand what you mean by diversion.
So what we mean by diversion is our recycling, food waste, and other materials like textiles, furniture donation, other donated items. We divide that by the total waste generated on campus to get our diversion rate. So on the table that I had shown, there's kind of like a white line that goes up. That is tracking what our diversion rate is. We use that same calculation for all of those. And like the most recent calculation there is the 52% that I had referred to. Does that
Okay, so, but when you say diversion, you mean what would wind up as waste is being diverted into a different direction? So that's what you mean by diversion rate.
Yes.
Am
Yeah.
I
So
right?
our diversion rate is if we look at like everything that we generate as a campus, and then what
Mhm.
is not going as waste, what is getting diverted to recycling,
Gotcha. Okay.
reuse, donation, any of those other material streams.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Appreciate it.
Great. Good question. I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you all.